As a matter of fact, Lincoln bombarded Five Points in New York. He sent the Navy up there to bombard them because of the anti-draft riots. These people said, you're gonna free all these slaves, and they're gonna come up and take our jobs." You know, the people aren't stupid. Of course, I'm not trying to justify slavery, not at all. But the common man was more interested in his own economic well-being. In any case, this set the stage. Okay, this set the stage.
All right. So how do we go from there to the modern era?
Well, there were several key steps, and we start with, believe it or not, with the Department of Justice. That was created in 1870 under the Grant administration. Eventually, they created the Bureau of Investigation in 1908, okay? And later it was renamed the FBI. From there, it began to move police powers from the states to the federal government, and the U.S. Code was beginning to be compiled. These are penal codes, okay, that the federal government was never supposed to have. But this became a model for the statutory creation of administrative bureaucracies. But the real turning point was the Revolution of 1913. This was a term coined by Dr. Tom DiLorenzo. Okay.
I already know where you're going with this. Bureaucrats with guns. And we went over this in a previous episode. But for our listeners, could you restate why 1913 is so significant?
Sure. The 16th Amendment established a permanent federal income tax, which allowed the federal government to reach directly into the pockets of citizens. Now, before this point, the federal government operated for the most part, with the exception of the period of the Civil War, they operated for the most part with tariffs, collecting rents, fines, selling government land, that kind of thing. But they needed to have the ability to reach their hands into the pockets of the citizens. Dr. DiLorenzo notes that this was an attack on private property, and he called it the reverse of the Revolution of 1787. He likened it to Willie Sutton's answer when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" He responded, "Because that's where the money is." Makes sense, right? You see, it was in the time frame that those in government were seeking other streams of income for the federal government aside from those permitted by the Constitution. Like I said, tariffs, rents, sales of government property, and excise taxes.
I think we're headed to the point where we talk about my favorite, the Federal Reserve System.
Exactly. It consolidated federal power over the economy with a private banking system. Okay? It was a sidestep since the Constitution does not provide for a central bank. A de facto one had to be created that mirrored the Bank of England. We went over this. We went over previous episodes. We also went over this coordinated effort to have a stable tax flow for the government to guarantee loans from the Federal Reserve. Okay? We went over that in a previous episode as well.
And let's get to the 17th Amendment.
What we would say in Italian is the colpo di grazia, or the French coup de grace, however you want to call it. Colpo di grazia. It came with the 17th Amendment. It mandated the direct election of senators, ending the practice of state legislatures appointing them, right? This was a fundamental change. It eliminated the role of the states as checks on federal power. It effectively nullified the concept of federalism from the government. This was precisely the lost cause coming to fruition that the ex-Confederates lamented would occur, okay? It's exactly why they fought to prevent that. But of course, if you mention the lost cause, you'll get denigrated. Oh, that's it was a hoax. It's not a hoax. They were anti-federalist Jeffersonians. They saw what was going to happen.
So when that happened, senators were no longer acting as, quote, ambassadors of the states.
Exactly. Then at the state level, the federal government was seen as a foreign government. It was an offshore government to them. They became, and here's the thing, Rob, these senators became just another group of politicians competing for power and graft in Washington. And I would argue that with the 17th Amendment, our republic was dissolved by definition. Now, instead of being susceptible to corruption at the single state level, they are corruptible on a national and international level. They are no longer answerable to their states' assemblies, as in the past. They get kickbacks and payoffs from PACs and foreign interests. That's what we're seeing writ large with USAID, for example.
I've always seen these people getting rich at our expense, and I knew it couldn't have been by campaign contributions alone. I've asked myself many times why someone would spend millions to get elected to a job that pays a couple of $100,000 a year. I think it's clear now. It was never clear to me that the mechanism for these people to enrich themselves with the salaries they receive as a senator or a representative. There had to be a money-making machine under the hood that wasn't obvious to the American people.
Of course there was. Of course there was. You see, Rob, the fears of the anti-federalists have been proven right again and again throughout history. If there is an agency or department that can be abused, it will be abused. If there is a centralized power, it will be abused. You just cannot legislate morality, virtue, or adherence to the interests of the people. No amount of oath-taking can guarantee it either. The only way to ensure that no corruption occurs is to not create the agency or department where it may occur. That's why it was never intended at the federal level. The bureaucracy was never intended to be there. There was no fourth branch of government. There still isn't.
You know, a lot of the American people, many in the electorate, feel that these agencies, 4-letter, 3-letter agencies, are absolutely needed. You don't need to convince me about that. It seems logical. But Dr. Tom, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. Wasn't he the most influential agent of corruption against the premise of our government?
Oh, you mean Mr. Progressive? Wilson was vocal about overturning the original design of the U.S. government. He saw the Constitution as an outdated obstacle. He wanted a dynamic government freed from its chains, all right?
Sounds a bit Marxist to me.
No, it certainly was. He considered it all outdated principles. He wanted to discard the traditional checks and balances. Wilson's vision put governance in the hands of an elite class of administrative experts rather than following the chaotic business of self-government, okay? The aim was the complete destruction of the concept of individual rights and limited government power that were enshrined in our nation's founding documents. I'd argue that Wilson's emphasis on science and expertise as a guiding force was the cornerstone of the eventual rapid expansion of federal power and the rise of an unaccountable bureaucracy. Wilson's actions, including his segregationist racist views and praise for the film Birth of a Nation, showed a willingness to use government power to enforce his vision on society. His rejection of inherent individual rights and the promotion of a managed, directed population as part of a collective represent a stark departure from the principles of liberty and self-determination. It was Marxism, pure and simple. This departure has directly led to the overreaching federal government we're battling today.
Yes, government reimagined, unburdened by what has been.
Yeah.
I would have placed a winning bet that that's what you would have said.
Wow, you would have won. Now, Rob, I want to make one thing clear. Now listen carefully. The Hamiltonians understood tyranny just as well as the Jeffersonians.